thanks very much for coming back to talk to me about the important conversation about culture and the execution of strategy.
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
Last time we were talking, you were talking about habits and the important habits leaders have got rather than a checklist of things to do, and the fact that leaders really had to start with role modeling, which I thought was interesting. But if we think about the reality of some organizations, do you think role modeling's enough of a habit? I mean, what if there's a really big gap between the culture as it is today and the culture a chief exec knows is going to be required for the strategy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think it talks very much to where a lot of organizations are right now in terms of being in the middle of a pandemic where, so much is changing. That there are very few organizations who are not looking at radically different strategies and also reflecting on what is the culture we've got and what is the culture we might need in order to pull off a different strategy to kind of wade into a completely different strategic direction without considering how that might be accepted or not by the culture. I think would be an oversight. I tend to think of culture as being like the environment your strategy lives in, and with various obstacles, things that help it, things that work against it or slow you down. I mean, the phrase "strategy eats culture for breakfast" is probably one of the most well-known phrases about culture, if you like. But right now there's a danger it will eat breakfast, dinner, and tea because of some of the radical things people are considering. If I reflect on my own career, most of the time, probably spent 90% of the time on the strategy, and 10% of the time in the culture. And I think over time that has shifted to a recognition that there's a choice. It's not all about strategy and then figure out how to make it work in your culture. It's about weighing up both and being willing to compromise. It's about respect, respecting the existing culture that maybe grew up over 10, 15, 20 years. It's not going to flip overnight just because you've invented a great new strategy. In fact, I'd go as far as to say if I was looking at a job as a new chief executive and I had a choice between a great strategy and a lukewarm culture, or a great culture and a need for a new strategy, I think if I wanted an easy life, I'd pick working on strategy rather than culture, to be honest. It's more of a craft, if you like. So so I think there's something about recognize that there is a choice between culture and strategy. It can be an iterative discussion that's best had together to say, well, if that's our culture and that's our ideal strategy, is that too countercultural, or is there something in the middle where we might, move a bit slower but get more benefit over time? So I'm not saying don't try and change the culture. I guess I'm saying be respectful that it might take longer than you think if it's quite a radical strategy.
It's a really interesting word, respectful, that I heard you say. Respecting the existing culture doesn't mean you can't work to change it, but you've got to respect the grain of the wood that you're working with. I like that.
With the grain would be a great. I remember taking on a new role once, and it was in a difficult, fairly distressed organization, and the guy I was working for said, this is a traditional manufacturing business, and there are some obvious things not right, but have some respect for the culture. This is a 100-year-old organization. You can't, you're going to come at it with fresh ideas, but just try and bring the culture with you. I mean, I love, there's an analogy about major surgery, major organ transplants. Sometimes the body rejects the new heart or the new liver, and I think there's something about that happening in organizations where a new strategy is such a radical shift. Not that it's not necessary, it's just, give it time and, work with the culture.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on that word, though, because I've heard people say, trying to nail culture is like trying to nail blancmange to the wall, and lots of different people have got different thoughts on on what it is. So it's a really vague term. And
Yeah.
have you got examples, or have you got thoughts on how you get alignment throughout the
Yeah.
organization if the word means so many different things to different people?
Yeah, I've certainly had some difficult experience with my passion for culture. Working with people who kind of said, "Well, it's just too subjective, too hazy, too difficult to nail to the wall, if you like." So, I guess one of my pieces of advice would be, try and avoid the culture word if it doesn't work for people. For me, it's a great word to collectively pull together what is quite a complex set of issues and relationships and working practices, but it can put people off. I like to talk about habits and working practices. If you ask people to define culture, they will typically say it's about how we do the work around here, how we work around here. And I think it's helpful to look at, okay, so tell me about some of the habits or some of the working practices, and tell me about what works and kind of doesn't work. And try and have a conversation that's kind of grounded in the language that senior executives understand. Let's talk about performance issues. Where are the operational hotspots in your organization? Where's change working well, and where is it slowing down? Let's examine those areas and try and get to the root cause, which has typically got a major behavioral component. But senior executives will engage in a conversation about key operational issues much more readily. And if the conversation is well facilitated, you will begin to identify patterns across them, like a top-down style of change management, or a difficulty having the difficult conversations, or unmanaged conflict, and those patterns begin to emerge. And it's turning, the conversation then becomes about, well, if that's, we need to try and move away from some of those kind of behavioral habits before new strategies will work. So, and I think it's always interesting to look at the stories that people tell about an organization. If I'm working with an organization, in the early days, I would probably learn a lot more having dinner at night or a drink in the evening than I will in a workshop, as people start to unwind and talk about the great things that have been achieved, or the great frustrations, and often that tells you about the culture. But I think it's helpful to move on from that and then try and establish a common language for discussing culture, a common definition, and some sense of, well, what are the key levers that drive culture, and how might we talk about our challenges through a cultural lens, and that helps to then drive activity, because everything you do affects culture. Every decision you make, every behavior you display affects culture. But if you don't have a clear picture of your desired culture, then you can't make that multitude of decisions with moving the culture. Let's say you wanted a very agile culture, well, let's look at everything we do. How could we be more free-flowing, less rigid, less bureaucratic about that might help us move forward. Mm-hmm. So that language is important, and a common understanding of what you mean by culture and how you shift it, is a real foundation stone that needs a lot of attention, I
think. We're coming to the end of our time, Alistair. Have you had one last piece of advice for a leader in this space? One last habit you think they're going to have to think about?
I guess the piece of advice I would give leaders most now, and it's pertinent to today, is to look back at the last 3 months, of this amazing, challenging period of disruption, and identify, what were some of the things that you managed to do overnight almost, that typically would have taken you 2 or 3 months before, old habits that just were parked in order to shift to working from home, or re-engineer your supply chain overnight. Whatever it was you'd done, have a think about, if you'd done it effectively and quickly, what did you learn about your culture? Because as things get back to some kind of normal, there's a danger of that, you'll have some habits that you think, well, now's a chance to draw a line under that, and let's stop working in that way. Let's work the way we worked, when we had all that urgency and focus, and a lot of creativity as well. So, reflect on the last 3 months to help you understand the culture you have and some of the things that work to achieve what you've achieved, and some of the things that got in the way of some of the choices you made, or you made some wrong choices. What did that tell you about your culture?
Mm. Yeah, I can feel some deep listening is going to be
Yeah.
required to just
Yeah.
maybe slow down and listen, and then move fast with what's required to do.
Well,
Alison, always a delight to
yes,
chat,
well,
and
yeah,
such an important subject.
great stuff. Let's talk again soon. Bye.
Okay, thanks very much.